Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I very recently saw Jamie, Lena, and Demain energy extremely egregiously lying that I'm being given opportunities that are joyous by them. It's both a lie that I'm actually being given any actual opportunities at all by them, as well as that any potential opportunities I'm seeing them perhaps trying to push me towards are anything I'd actually consider joyous. They most certainly did not ever at all seek my consent for pushing me in whatever direction they may be trying to, particularly in any kind of manner where they appeared to be framing me as practically desperately in need of their guidance and or validation, which is completely false. I also see Jamie and Lena energy more specifically additionally continuing to try to force onto me embracing meeting someone new in my life in a manner that quite clearly appears to me to be an egregious compromise of my integrity. Perhaps Kimmy's energy has some part in that which I'm not really able to see clearly and may even be substantially masked to others as well, obviously entirely at my expense against my consent to whatever extent it might be the case, since Jamie's explicitly admitted in recent times that she currently has a codependent connection with Kimmy, which is something Jamie considers strange. I imagine all three of Kimmy, Jamie, and Lena are most likely the most desperate of anyone else to try to make me seem like I've been a massive fraud in how interested in and attracted to Kimmy I've really always felt, since that's probably been the most foundational pillar upon which they based their egregious betrayals of me. Further, it seems there may be lies going around that I've ever thought people are jealous of my physical appearance. That's entirely false as well. I've always only ever suspected anyone to be jealous of me for the light I carry that comes from the strength of my personality, which comes from my mental framework of having refined pure bidirectional apprehension as my core value. If I had a physical appearance particularly worth being jealous of, I imagine it'd be a lot less likely I'd be as smart and powerful as I am, and yet still struggle so extremely badly to have anyone actually show me anything even remotely resembling something I'd consider actually caring about me in any substantial and actually useful manner. The email address SharonSincerely@gmail.com is one I once owned, but is now most certainly hacked. I don't know how long ago someone hacked it, but they literally took over complete control of the account and changed both the password and the recovery email. If I try to recover the account, the recovery email is a non-Gmail email address, and it's completely unrecognizable to me. I suspect whoever has permanently stolen access to that account from me is somehow criminally impersonating me and attempting to pass false narratives about me as truth through that entirely falsifies supposed at all consensual access to my energy. It's one or more individuals that in reality have never had any consensual access to my energy at all to do whatever they're trying to do to me now. I don't know who it is and do not take any responsibility for any of their behavior. I myself have never sent anyone any emails through that email address, even when I did actually have access to it. Whoever hacked that email most likely has messed with narratives around the @SharonSincerely Twitter account, and something extremely serious is going on around it that Elon is supporting somehow. I imagine it most likely has something to do with the criminals that have attempted to frame me for putting a hit out on Elon and or Trump. For some strange reason, if I'm not logged in, viewing the profile says it hasn't made any tweets, but when I log into my @TheDarkRedPill Twitter account, the only Twitter account I actually have access to, I see the tweets I once made on the @SharonSincerely account when I still had access to it. I made 3 tweets on May 13, 2023, June 11, 2023, and June 12, 2023, at least according to Twitter. I honestly don't remember if the dates exactly are accurate, since those days don't particularly stand out to me for any other reasons, although I do recall actually creating the content of the tweets myself for sure. However, I've completely lost access to that account now and do not claim and or accept any responsibility for any part of anything that's been happening on it for a long time. I also do not have any access to the mail@SharonSincerely.me email address, nor the SharonSincerely.me domain, and also haven't had any access to them for a long time either. Also, I'm not sure if it's related at all, but I feel I should also mention that I once created a Sharon Park Facebook account, but I've long since forgotten the password and do not actually have any access to it anymore, and haven't for a long time either. I also don't see any reason for me to particularly care about that. I'm not going to wait for Google to maybe or maybe not restore my access to Gmail on the Dark Red Pill podcast @gmail.com account. So I've just today created the email address, thedarkredpillsocial@gmail.com, and have publicly officially changed my podcast's contact email address to that address. I've also transferred ownership of my podcast's YouTube channel over to it, although I have to wait a few days to finalize the transfer, but that shouldn't affect the public's access to the channel at all. I'm also in the process of transferring over the entire official transcript document Google Drive folder to the new official email address for this podcast, and I'll be fixing any potentially broken links within the next day or two if changing sharing settings breaks any of the links I've posted publicly. A link to the entire Google Drive folder containing the official transcript documents for every release has now been supplied on the podcast's official YouTube channel description as well, to try to make it clear that I'm not trying to hide anything or make any excuses to try to use this as an opportunity to do anything shady with the transcripts while I transfer them to the new account. The link will be updated promptly if I end up finding the need to recreate the folder entirely and copy and paste each transcript individually into new documents created on the new account, and I'll also be updating the links present in individual video descriptions if necessary as well. I've also decided to make 2 major changes to how I send out emails to my mailing list from this new email address, so it's hopefully not restricted. I've now decided to only send out emails to a smaller version of the mailing list that basically only includes influencers from the official email, and I'll send copies of that email to the rest from my personal Gmail account. I'll be ensuring to include the message about how to unsubscribe as the very first thing in the email in both. My phone rather extremely struggles to grasp at what I'm thinking about most of the time, but conspiratory actors trying to act like I'm losing my mind are probably pretending otherwise in order to attempt to criminally impersonate my energy and attempt to basically eliminate all meaningful substance to my continued existence so they can completely devour the life I should be living for themselves entirely at my expense against my consent. I haven't seen any buildings I'd say are in the wrong place. There aren't any dates I feel aren't adding up to memories I've had in the past. I haven't been feeling memories as too sharp or too distant, only either as something I actually see as anything I'd recall as real, or something so egregiously fabricated it's evident someone's just trying to brainwash me and or others into believing something substantially, if not completely fake, is real. Certain strangers around me certainly seem to change seemingly randomly, but I don't know if I'd say those around them necessarily don't notice, although they may or may not. I don't know or particularly see any adequate reason to care. I'm hearing I'm the only one who doesn't know what happened last night. Apparently, there's a truth that's escaped my ears, sight, and heart. It unfolded in silence while I slept. Every soul involved vowed to keep me in the dark. It shifted everything around me without my awareness, editing stories before they reach my ears. They didn't think the truth would catch up this fast, but the spiritual realm sees and is exposing it to me. I'm hearing while I was resting, conversations happened, looks exchanged, hands shaking behind closed doors. A meeting was held and my name came up not once but several times. Nobody stood up to defend me, not even a person being described as someone I thought loved me the most. Clearly, they're lying egregiously about how I see them because I don't feel anyone really loves me at all. My absence in that meeting last night was exactly what those scumbags needed, apparently. They spoke about me like I'm not even real, like my feelings don't matter, like my future can be decided without me. A decision that affects the next chapter of my life was sealed without my knowledge, or at least that's what they were trying to do. Something very personal about me was discussed with selfish intentions, and now the consequences are spiraling into the physical world. Someone made a vow, a dark promise in exchange for power, and the cost of that deal was my peace. I do not consent to paying that cost. I never did, and I never will. If I had to guess, all that stuff probably relates somehow to that hacked email and some massive lie that I was trying to achieve some ulterior motive through it, and the associated Twitter account I've both just explicitly revealed as having been hacked probably for quite some time now already. There was never any ulterior motive I was trying to achieve with them. I don't particularly care that they're hacked beyond false narratives that might be getting validated about me against my consent through them. Whoever has access to them is operating with complete disregard for my consent and is not being instructed at all by me on what they choose to do with that access they stole from me. I'm noticing certain extremely creepy people effectively stalking me in more recent times. I believe they're involved in the same criminal activity attempting to frame me for murder and prostitution that in reality has absolutely zero real evidence to substantiate any such claims about me. I have random people I don't know and don't want to be involved with or even associate with at all, asking me for charging cables and messing with mine sometimes when they're plugged in and I perhaps walk away briefly. They unplug it and try to irritate me, obviously in a manner that the cables wouldn't just fall off the plug, as if we're friends and they're having fun pulling some kind of friendly prank on one of their buddies or something. They hang around me randomly and seem to be trying to fabricate evidence on government cameras to attempt to make me seem as if at all ever having been even remotely consensually associated with them in any manner. I've never authorized the sending of any kind of recruitment letter or offers by snail mail to anyone with some kind of enclosed membership certificate to send anywhere with a signature. Specifically, some 20-year-old aspiring actress from Oklahoma is being shown in my energy as being offered such a thing from what is effectively obviously being framed as the authentic Shadow Confederation. Like I've said, I don't claim responsibility for the actions of every member, and such things must have been done by someone else, since I most certainly have never done such a thing, nor wanted to do such a thing. I've also never received such a thing myself, for the record. Also, for the record, I've never explicitly sworn on the Bible for anything, although Nuxanor seems like the type to do such a thing, with how I've seen he sometimes talks about having read the Bible practically as if it's some smoking gun to validate his assertions. Maybe he himself wouldn't find some immense weight in personally swearing on the Bible publicly, but at the very least, it seems to me like he's the type to be enabling and facilitating it, carrying substantial weight for individuals operating from the shadows under his influence somehow. I've also been hearing someone wanted so extremely badly to play God in my life that they intentionally chose to refuse to give me what's objectively fully warranted attention, and that certainly increasingly blatantly is seeming to me like Nuxanor. Of course, there are probably other people who exist out there that try to somehow substantially exploit their willingness to swear on the Bible and or implications of it, if we were to look at every person in the entire world. But there's nobody else my energy was ever drawn to in particular who I've seen specifically seem to find particular significance in having read the Bible. Not even any of the scumbags from my past who I've been calling out on this podcast. I'm seeing Pegasus now call Hassan Hamas Diddy Baby Oil Piker, so perhaps the latest egregious defamation of me is that I'm somehow afraid to call out Hassan for having baby oil somewhere in some creepy sex dungeon he does pedophilic things in? I don't know. I don't particularly care. But I'm most certainly not afraid of calling Hassan out for anything, in case that wasn't already clear. I also have absolutely no issue whatsoever with sending him to Gaza, even if that's effectively a death sentence for him. From what I can tell, he's the type to have knowingly contributed to causing the murder that I'm being framed for, that I have faced multiple hitmen coming after me, probably at least in part as a result of. Also, for the record, I don't particularly believe any of the Iranians on Mary's side of that family would openly support Iran's terrorist leadership. Whether or not they're willing to cooperate with and support it low-key in order to attempt to leverage that for selfish gain at my expense against my consent if they had the opportunity, I most certainly wouldn't put it past them to do such a thing. But I can't imagine any of them being so ridiculously out of touch and unhinged as to openly, explicitly support terrorists like Hassan, Hamas, Diddy, Baby Oil, Bin Laden, Piker. Also, I'm well aware that for the most part, the average Iranian in Iran doesn't actually like or want to support its current leadership. So just to be clear, my opposition towards Iran's leadership and anyone among those I once called family who come from Iran was never intended to represent a reflection of my feelings towards Iranians as a whole. I'd say it certainly sounds preferable if Trump can ultimately neutralize the threat of Iran getting nukes while making Israel's forces do the work with how they bombed Iran's nuclear sites and whatnot, and not have to get the U.S. forces involved directly with airstrikes or anything else. Also, I have never and do not support Iran trying to murder Donald Trump. Not because I particularly like Trump. I've just never seen anything I'd consider adequate reason to particularly dislike him either. And again, if I had to pick favorites between the US or Iran, I'd pick the US without hesitation. I don't find the most popular ice cream flavor in Iran relevant, nor what starter Pokemon is the average Pokemon picked by an Iranian child. I don't and have never found anyone's favorite ice cream flavor or favorite starter Pokemon particularly relevant, and it most certainly would never appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me regardless of what those things are for anyone in specific, nor even any general population. I have no particular stance towards John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz, and Laura Loomer.